thank you. It's really such a pleasure to be here, and I've never seen the English countryside, so we had a nice time trying to stay awake coming in from London to arrive here. But it really just is a pleasure. And I am a little sleep deprived. In the last probably 30 hours, I may have had 2 hours of sleep. I had a big deposition earlier in the week, so. But anyway, I'm happy to be here. It's a lot of data-based information, and this is the last talk of your day, so we don't have to feel as though we have to stick, completely to the slides. I have copies in the back, maybe not enough for everyone, but there are also handouts. I have the slides, and then I have 4 additional handouts that have descriptions of studies and different things that we'll be talking about. So the title is Abortion and Women's Mental and Relational Health. Abortion is unique. Unlike any other procedure, it results in an unnatural reversal of a woman's body to a non-pregnant state and the death of a biologically distinct, most often normally developing human embryo or fetus. The philosophical, moral, and political interpretations of these facts by those conducting, publishing, and disseminating research on abortion post-abortion mental health have led to highly conflicting conclusions. However, when the highest methodological standards are applied, there's clarity, and hopefully I'll bring it to light today. Lots of debate about what constitutes an adequate study on abortion and mental health. I've been doing a lot of expert work in the United States as various states have tried to enact restrictions on abortion, primarily informed consent laws, waiting period laws, and so forth. And so often what we're doing is we're debating lots of rebuttal reports. It's all about, this study's better than that study, and the conclusions are so discrepant. And I've personally felt a strong need to have an objective measure, a way to take all the literatures out there and evaluate it systematically. We need it for court cases, we need it to inform women, and so that's part of what I'll be discussing today. When we think about women who have undergone abortions, they just come from all walks of life, all demographic groups. They're single, married, and divorced. They range in age from as young as 10 to as old as 50. Some have dropped out of high school, and others have advanced degrees. They come from every income group. They're very poor to the very wealthy, and they represent all races, the religious and the non-religious. So these are the basic questions that I'll address today. What risk factors for post-abortion mental health problems are the most well-established and the least controversial in the world literatures? Does the strongest scientific evidence indicate abortion increases risk for particular forms of mental illness? And then based on the highest quality research, is abortion associated with detriments in the quality of women's closest relationships? The world literatures on abortion and women's mental and relational health has grown considerably over the past few decades, and the scientific rigor of the published studies has increased substantially. Just a minute. Sorry, I have a separate screen here, and I'm having a little difficulty. Sorry. 1 second. I apologize. The focus of the research has been on identification of risk factors for and the frequency of post-abortion psychological and relational problems. A search of peer-reviewed articles conducted a few years ago yielded over 100 studies documenting risk factors for post-abortion psychological difficulties, and I will provide an overview of the most common ones, and I have a handout. It's handout number 1 in the back if anyone's interested, detailing the actual studies. I undertook this investigation in 2011 for work I was doing with South Dakota. I have my son, who now is a research. He's actually a doctoral student at Princeton studying biology, but he was desperate for money that summer, so he helped me identify the articles. Initially, we found close to 400 abstracts that potentially had articles, and so it was a real process of finding every study published from approximately 1972 to 2011. And then we looked at those that had the most support, and that was helpful to the 1217 bill in South Dakota. So now women are being informed of the risk factors and whether or not and are counseled as to whether or not they fall into a high-risk group. So how do scientists actually define a risk factor? A risk factor is any variable that increases the probability of an outcome. Risk factor data are used to understand etiology, warn patients of potential problems associated with exposures, and develop effective prevention and intervention protocols to maximize health. Risk is expressed in terms of absolute risk, which is the chance of developing an illness over time. For example, a 10% lifetime risk of suicide, or in terms of relative risk, which is a comparison of the probability of an event adverse outcome in two groups. For example, is there a higher risk of having depression if you have a prior abortion or if you've carried to term? Most of the research conducted on abortion and mental health is of the latter form. And so what are the most well-researched factors from or predictors of mental health problems that are evidenced in the professional literatures? If the woman is pressured or coerced by others to abort, there's a minimum of 14 studies. I think there have been a few more in the last couple of years, and there are many laws now in the U.S. that are considered anti-coercion laws, where the state guarantees that abortion providers will spend some time interviewing women to see if they are under any pressure. Whether it's subtle pressure by a boyfriend or very active pressure by parents who are, giving typically it's an adolescent, no say in their choice. So it's an interesting variable because it's from very subtle pressure, just feeling like other people would rather you not carry on with the pregnancy, all the way to threats of women's lives if they don't pursue an abortion. If the pregnant woman was ambivalent about the abortion, experienced decisional difficulty, and or had a high degree of decisional distress, 27 studies. She was committed to the pregnancy, or she preferred to carry the child to term, so the decision really was not her own, similar to that pressure variable. She had pre-abortion mental health or psychiatric problems, 41 studies. This is an important variable because you often will hear the average woman doesn't have problems with an abortion procedure. It's only women who have prior mental health problems, and the abortion exacerbates those problems, or we're really just measuring a continuum of psychiatric difficulties. There was a study published in 2013 where the authors reported women who had an abortion were 3 times more likely to indicate a prior mental disorder, 5 times more likely to experience drug dependence, and over 4 times more likely to report alcohol dependence compared to a reference sample. And mental illness often interferes with adaptive decision making, underscoring the need for sensitive pre-abortion counseling. The results also highlight the importance of controlling for prior mental health when investigating effects of abortion. We'll talk about the meta-analysis that I published in the British Journal of Psychiatry in a little bit in 2011, but it was interesting because reports in the media and the systematic review that the Royal College of Psychiatrists produced, they said that I didn't control they were reviewing everything out there, that I didn't control for prior mental health. That was just absolutely not true. If you look at the actual study, a meta-analysis is a quantitative review of many studies, and 22 studies were incorporated into that meta-analysis. 14 had controls for prior mental health. And I still saw that systematic effect. If the pregnant woman was an adolescent or a young adult, 18 studies, oftentimes adolescents are pressured or coerced by parents or by boyfriends to abort. They also tend to hide their pregnancy longer, so they're more inclined to have a later abortion, and with later abortions, women are at a higher level of risk. So 40 years of research have shown that when specific physical, psychological, demographic, and situational factors are operative in women's lives, they're at a significantly increased risk of post-abortion mental health problems. Several abortion doctors agree on risk factors. A textbook by abortion doctors titled Management of Unintended and Abnormal Pregnancy, Comprehensive Abortion Care by Paul and colleagues lists many risk factors and a chapter on counseling. These are the risk factors that are in that textbook. When there's commitment and attachment to the pregnancy, perceived coercion, significant ambivalence, putting great effort into keeping the abortion a secret for fear of stigma, advanced stage of pregnancy, pre-existing experience of trauma, so the trauma is compounded, past or present sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, unresolved past losses and perception of abortion as a loss, fetal abnormality or other medical indications for the abortion, intense guilt and shame before the abortion, an existing emotional disorder or mental illness prior to the abortion, appraisal of abortion as extremely stressful before it occurs, expecting depression, severe grief or guilt, and regret after the abortion, and belief that abortion is the same act as killing a newborn infant. So these are risk factors recognized by the abortion industry. So we really aren't debating what are the variables that place women at risk. It's resolved, essentially. And the American Psychological Association published a report in 2008, and they identified some of the same risk factors: a wanted or meaningful pregnancy, pressure from others, lack of social support, commitment to the pregnancy, ambivalence about the decision, low perceived ability to cope. So despite the availability of strong research documenting risk factors and professional awareness, abortion providers rarely, if ever, routinely screen for risk factors and counsel women at risk. And now in South Dakota, they do that, but that is a very, it's an innovative bill. We don't see that elsewhere in terms of risk factors. And now turning to post-abortion mental health research, focusing more on the outcomes and some of the issues with conducting the research. As a sensitive topic, conducting meaningful, sound research on abortion and mental health is notoriously difficult to conduct. Women are often reluctant to disclose their abortion histories, are unwilling or unable to revisit their abortion for research purposes, or fail to continue for any length of time. Studies show that about 50% of women do not disclose a prior abortion history. So their histories are not in medical records, they're not reflected in the studies that are conducted. More serious than this, though, are the seldom discussed professional gatekeepers who encourage agenda-driven research and ignore fundamental scientific principles to fill journals with, quote, evidence that abortion poses no risk to women's health. Whoops. In the United States, there are we're seeing increasingly desperate times for the abortion industry as proponents of unrestricted access seek to block women-centered abortion laws, backed by strong empirical evidence, while silencing the voices of brave women standing up to share their post-abortion struggles. A cursory look at literature produced by various professional organizations, stories in the mainstream media, and research published by investigators motivated by an ideological bias in favor of unrestricted access to abortion might lead one to conclude that abortion poses little to no threat to the psychological well-being of women. And if studies do in fact demonstrate adverse mental health outcomes in association with abortion, it's because the studies are flawed or the researchers are, like me, are seeking to end abortion. What once appeared to be a subtle mainstream journal bias in favor of publishing results suggesting abortion poses no threat to women's psyches is now a peer review process blind to scientific deficiencies as long as the results further abortion rights initiatives. To illustrate just how professional scientific standards are compromised, I'm going to use an example of a study recently published in JAMA Psychiatry. It was published in 2017. Next, I'll describe a rubric I developed to objectively evaluate studies on abortion and mental health. When this tool is applied, it becomes clear that the strongest studies available do in fact reveal that abortion increases risk of mental health problems. So in 2017, Biggs and colleagues published their article in JAMA Psychiatry. The title was Women's Mental Health and Well-Being 5 Years After Being Denied an Abortion, a Prospective Longitudinal Cohort Study. And this is a premier journal in terms of reputation. It has a high impact factor, which means if a journal has a high impact factor, it's being cited frequently in other articles. I use it in my teaching at Bowling Green State University as an example of a very poorly conducted study. Undergraduate students and research methods are able to identify the flaws, and yet it was published in this journal because of the findings being consistent with the dominant agenda. The authors, I'll just tell you more about it and we'll critique it a little bit. The authors compared U.S. women who had abortions just under legal gestational limits with women who wanted an abortion but were denied because they were just over gestational limit, and that group was called the turnaway group. The turnaway group included those who gave birth and those who later obtained an abortion or miscarried. Results were reported to indicate, quote, women who were denied an abortion, in particular those who later miscarried or had an abortion elsewhere, turnaway, no birth group, had the most elevated levels of anxiety and lowest self-esteem and life satisfaction 1 week after being denied an abortion, which quickly improved and approached levels similar to those in the other groups by 6 to 12 months. The author's objective for publishing the study is introduced in the opening line. They say, quote, the idea that abortion leads to adverse psychological outcomes has been the basis for legislation mandating counseling before obtaining an abortion and other policies restricting abortion. As well as at the close of their article, they state, there's no evidence to justify laws that require women seeking abortion to be forewarned about negative psychological responses. Well, scientists should never make such sweeping conclusions based on a single study. If you look at the funding, was from the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, among other sources, with a political agenda, as described on their website for this foundation. Quote, our work in the United States seeks to advance reproductive health and rights for women and young people by improving access to quality, comprehensive sexuality education, family planning, and safe abortion care. So some of the most glaring methodological shortcomings in the JAMA Psychiatry article include the fact that only 37.5% of women invited to take part in the study actually participated, and across the study period, 42% of those dropped out, leaving under 22% in the final study group. The 78% of women whose voices are not included were likely those who had the most serious post-abortion psychological complications. And there are actually other studies that have compared individuals who drop out to those who stay in a longitudinal type investigation, and this reality has been documented. Those that don't come back or don't return the surveys are those that are suffering the most. With sensitive research, securing a high initial consent rate and avoiding sample loss are vital to the validity of the conclusions. The authors even acknowledge this fact as they state, we cannot rule out the possibility that women with adverse mental health outcomes may have been less likely to participate and or been retained. In a previous article with the same data published in PLOS One, the authors noted that the sample had a high concentration of women from low socioeconomic backgrounds, not representative of U.S. women undergoing abortion today. Yet in the current article, the research group stated, given the large number and range of recruitment facilities representing geographically diverse regions in the U.S., 30 clinics from 21 states, and that our sample demographics are consistent with those of a nationally representative samples of women seeking abortion, we believe these results are generalizable. Well, a sample is either representative or it's not. You can't change your mind, study the study. The authors also failed to reveal consent to participate rates by group. Second trimester abortions are potentially more traumatizing than first trimester procedures. Therefore, it is likely that a significantly higher percentage of women in the first trimester group compared to those in the second trimester group consented to participate. In the Turnaway study, women who had abortions near the gestational limits included women for whom the legal cutoff ranged from 10 to 27 weeks because the states vary so much. There's a wealth of data indicating that women's reasons for choosing abortion and their emotional responses to the procedure differ greatly at varying points of pregnancy. Women aborting at widely varying gestational age just shouldn't be lumped together. The authors do not explain how the sites were actually chosen, what type of sampling plan was employed, why were only those identified with the National Abortion Federation used, what cities were included, which areas of the country were sampled. All four outcome measures, and this is probably the fatal flaw in my opinion, all four, well, I don't know if it's worse than the retention of only 22% of the participants, but all four outcome measures are shockingly simplistic, with two variables containing only 6 items and 2 variables measured with single items. This is inexcusable given the many psychometrically sound multiple item surveys available in the literature. They looked at depression, they looked at anxiety, they looked at variables that we have excellent measures for, so why not include an established measure? Finally, the authors suggest that later abortions are healthier for women than childbirth. This obscures the well-documented risks of late abortions to women's physical well-being, in addition to the elevated psychological risks. So, for example, there's a study that was conducted by Bartlett and colleagues, published in 2004, that reported the relative risk of abortion-related mortality was 14.7 per 100,000 abortions at 13 to 15 weeks gestation. It jumps to 29.5 at 20 weeks and 76.6 per 100,000 at 20 weeks or later. Many narrative reviews of the literature published in recent years involved, so kind of shifting away from Biggs now, there have been many narrative reviews of the literature published in recent years have involved specified evaluation criteria that resulted in dismissal of large bodies of evidence with results that were politically unsavory. To illustrate the tactics employed by the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the RCP, in their 2011 literature review is relevant, especially here, and it's a very high-profile example. This review was pitched as methodologically superior to all previous reviews based on the criteria employed to critique individual studies. However, the quality skills, they call them quality skills, were not well validated, and they required a significant level of subjective interpretation, opening the results to considerable bias. but I have to give them credit for when this review was in the drafting stage, they allowed, it was open online to anybody who wanted to critique it. Unlike the American Psychological Association review that they published in 2008, where they solicited peer review from 20 different individuals. I was a peer reviewer, probably like a token peer reviewer from the non-pro-choice side. But with the Royal College, they allowed anyone interested to review. Doesn't mean they paid attention to it, but they allowed for that. It was a little more open of a process. The main problems with the RCP scales were as follows. The categories used were missing key methodological features, like initial consent to participate and retention of participants across the study period. The relative importance of the included criteria was arbitrary as opposed to being based on scientific principles. The specific requirements for assigning a plus or minus within the categories were not provided. The authors failed to explain how combinations of pluses and minuses in the distinct categories added up to an overall rating ranging from very poor to very good. And there was a 1995 study by Gilchrist and colleagues which received a rating of good in the RCP review despite few controls for confounding variables, meaning the comparison groups likely differed systematically in income, relationship quality, including exposure to domestic violence, which we know we need to control for now, social support, and other potentially critical factors. Gilchrist and colleagues reported retaining only 34.4% of the termination group and only 43.4% of the non-termination group at the end of the study. No standardized measures for mental health diagnoses were employed. An evaluation of the psychological state of patients was reported by general practitioners, not psychiatrists or psychologists. So despite these facts, the study received a mark of plus for confounder control, a plus for representativeness, and a plus for validated tools. Interestingly, the review that was published by the American Psychological Association basically concluded this was the only valid study out of the hundreds of studies available in the literature. Their conclusion was based on one study. You just don't do that in science. The rubric in handout number 2, if anyone's interested, there are copies back there, outlines several methodological features with particular relevance to the topic of abortion and mental health, incorporating a scheme for evaluating individual studies. The rubric was presented in my recently published peer-reviewed journal article in the American Journal of Physicians and Surgeons. So just to tell you a little bit about this rubric that I've developed, and then I'm working with students to pull all the studies that have looked at the association between abortion history and mental health outcomes over a 40-year period. We're going to take every study, have 2 people evaluate based on these criteria, and hopefully get that published in not too long. But 9 criteria are employed in my scheme here. There are 5 anchor points for which scores of 0 to 4 are assigned, resulting in potential scores from 0 to 36, since there are 9 different criteria. So the rubric is available back there as well. But when the criteria are applied, this is what's interesting, and I reported this in the article. When the criteria are applied to the most recently published studies addressing that association between abortion history and mental health, including the big study, the data reveal the average total score for studies indicating abortion increases risk for mental health problems is 28. The average score for studies indicating abortion is not a risk factor for mental health problems is only 18.3. These data suggest that a straightforward approach directed at scrutinizing methodological strengths and weaknesses of individual studies will bring clarity to a complex literature. Unlike previous attempts to evaluate key features of individual studies, this scheme offers a more comprehensive list of methodological elements along with detailed anchoring points, minimizing subjective interpretation. So when we look at the body of evidence that relates to psychological consequences, despite these concerted efforts to obscure the reality, an abundant literature comprised of methodologically sophisticated studies from around the world now indicates abortion significantly increases risk for the following mental health problems. We know it increases risk for depression, for anxiety, for substance abuse. The link between prior abortion and substance abuse is very strong. Alcohol, marijuana use, other forms of substance abuse. And that it's believed to be, I wrote a review on that association. I think it was published back in 05 or 06. But one of the reasons we suspect that's one of the stronger effects is because if a woman is suffering from an abortion, she's not comfortable sharing that experience with others because of guilt and shame. And so then she's left kind of dealing with it on her own. And in our society, substances are easily attained. It's a way to just, stop the suffering. So sadly, there is a strong association there. I served on a case in New Jersey. Stacy Zally was the name of the girl, a civil case. She was pressured into an abortion by her boyfriend and by the father of the boyfriend. Her family didn't know anything about the abortion until after her death. She went into a period of extensive substance abuse. She hardly drank prior. Her goal in life was basically to get married, have children, and become a teacher. No prior psych history. She was going to a psychiatrist, and he didn't even identify the fact that she had had an abortion. So she's basically suffering alone. But she was drinking very heavily, and then finally took her life by hanging herself in her room at a very young age, 21, 22, and. So that was a long effort and the abortion provider was Stephen Brigham, who is not part of Planned Parenthood. He's someone in the United States who has overseen over 300,000 abortions. He's lost his medical license in different states. My role in that case was to take a look at the information that was provided to her to make that decision. And he had the most ridiculous, he called it a fact sheet that I've ever seen. It had things on that sheet that said it's common for women to have 20 or more abortions, and after an abortion they often feel a sense of new hope and happiness. It was utterly ridiculous. And but with Stacy, you saw a lot of the risk factors that we talked about earlier. She wanted the pregnancy. It was just the saddest thing, and destroyed the family. The mom became agoraphobic and alcoholic, and she never left the home. They renovated the house. They had sealed off Stacy's room for many years. Then when they, like 5 or 6 years later, they were renovating and they found a second suicide note that she actually said, "Now I can be with my unborn baby, Brittany Lee." Her original suicide note said something like, "I can't live a lie." But even in her death, she was too ashamed to state, the abortion. And so it was just this, saddest case. A minimum of 20 to 30% of women who abort do suffer serious, prolonged negative psychological consequences, and there is an increased risk of suicide. For that Zally case and for work I've done with South Dakota, I've calculated the percentage of suicides that are directly attributable to abortion each year in the United States. And there are different ways of calculating it, but it's between about 45 and 200 that are where an abortion is the primary cause of the suicide. Abortion's further associated with a higher risk of negative psychological outcomes when compared to unintended pregnancy carried to term. And the data indicate that risk for long-term psychological injury is considerably higher with abortion than with other forms of perinatal loss. And then this is that study I mentioned, the meta-analysis. I took the strongest studies published between 1995 and 2009, and they're synthesized in this article published in 2011. Just a little bit about what a meta-analysis is, if you're not familiar. It's a quantitative review of the literature. There are narrative reviews where the researcher essentially reads studies and kind of puts them together in a way that they believe is cohesive. But quantitative reviews are considered higher levels of evidence by systematically combining the numerical results from many high-quality studies that address the same basic question. And in this case, the question is there an association between abortion and mental health? Very reliable results are produced. Studies are weighted statistically, and meta-analysis offers a logical, more objective alternative to traditional, more narrative reviews. So the meta-analysis, which included 36 adjusted odds ratios from 22 studies, resulted in a pooled odds ratio of 1.81. This means women who have had an abortion experience an 81% higher risk for mental health problems of various forms compared to women who have not had an abortion. And when you take all of those studies together, the number of women that were actually incorporated was over 800,000. So it really does stand as the biggest study in the world on abortion and mental health, and it's amazing how it just gets ignored. And when it was published, there were obviously a lot of attack of me, attack on the results, the methodology, and fortunately Peter Tyrer, the editor, allowed me to write a rebuttal report, and there were several supportive letters as well. One of the supportive letters came from David Ferguson, who's a researcher in New Zealand. He's published over 500 studies, is very well respected, well known. His primary focus in his academic work has been on domestic violence and substance abuse, but he happened to have a longitudinal data set where he followed women in New Zealand for 25 years, and his studies showed pretty dramatic effects associated, abortion was associated with an increased risk of anxiety, depression, suicide, and so forth. And we've had a number of correspondence. He was supportive when I was evaluated at Bowling Green for promotion, for tenure, and then promotion to full professor. He's pro-choice. He describes himself as a rational atheist. He's as disgusted as I am in terms of how biased this research is. So he wrote a very supportive letter. It wasn't all just, throwing stones at me and my methodology, but this is a figure from the meta-analysis, and even though you can't see all the studies and all the effects there, you can see the pattern of results. If you look at the quadrant to the right of the middle line, that you can just squint your eyes and barely see the diagram and realize that there's something systematic going on. If abortion were not associated with these mental health outcomes, all of those lines would be situated around the very middle line there. Instead, they're shifted to that right quadrant. So looking at population attributable risk, or the PAR statistic, percentages from the pooled odds ratios, we're able to conclude that nearly 10% of the incidence of mental health problems was directly attributable to abortion. That means if abortion were not available, 10% of women who suffer from mental health conditions of various forms would not be afflicted. And I'm just kind of shifting a little bit to medical abortion, which has become increasingly common in the UK and elsewhere in the world. According to the Department of Health, there were over 190,000 abortions carried out in England and Wales in 2016, slightly lower than in 2015. In 2016, there were 4,810 abortions for non-residents carried out in hospitals and clinics in England and Wales compared to 5,190 in 2015. The 2016 total is the lowest in any year since 1969. Medical abortions accounted for 62% of all abortions in England and Wales. This is higher than in 2015 and more than double the proportion in 2006. Medical abortions accounted for 82.9% of terminations performed in Scotland in 2016. So there's a pretty dramatic shift from surgical abortion to medical abortion. I prefer to call it chemical abortion because I don't really see it as medicine or healthcare, particularly after work that I've recently done with Missouri. I've been on 4 cases in the last year as an expert with Missouri. The most recent was to evaluate the quality of research related to medical abortion and the risks associated. I'm not a medical doctor, so I didn't assess clinical risks, but I looked at every study published involving medicine abortion, and in the U.S. and particularly in Missouri, if there's a complication rate, they passed a law where if there's a complication rate of more than 1% associated with chemical abortion, then abortion providers must have a complication plan where there's an OBGYN available 24 hours a day. And so there, there's all these stipulations, and anyway, so it's a literature that's fairly new to me, but also kind of fresh. I was deposed in the case on Tuesday this week, but so chemical, what exactly is medical abortion? This chemical form of abortion involves 2 medications, most commonly mifepristone and misoprostol. The procedure is typically used up to 9 weeks gestation. The former medication separates the embryo from the uterus, and the latter is taken 24 to 48 hours after the first medication to expel the embryo. Our focus here is on psychological implications of abortion. However, I recently, like I just said, examined the physical, the complications associated with chemical abortion. So handout 4, if you're interested in this topic, provides an overview of some of the better studies on this topic. Most of the studies that I summarized there in that handout are based on record-based data. And record-based data where you're using medical codes is often far superior to other study forms because you capture everyone who had an abortion in the data set. And when we know there are high rates of concealment, high rates of dropout, all kinds of issues when data is collected other ways, the record-based studies that capture all of the data available for a particular population, it's just much more meaningful scientifically. I think I said that. As revealed by the data in the handout, between 5.6 and 13% of first trimester medical abortions end up requiring surgical intervention, and an alarming 21 to 33% of second trimester medical abortions require surgery. In the U.S., in California, there's an initiative to make medical abortion available on all state college campuses, and Daniel Grossman is behind, abortion provider out there, is behind a lot of that effort. He was one of the experts on the other side that I recently had to rebut. So I took his report and wrote a rebuttal. So we're going back and forth with Grossman. And it was interesting just in reading what he would put in one of these reports. He's published a lot, very selective use of studies. Even his own studies had written results, conclusions that were opposite to what he put in his expert report. So let's look a little bit at medical abortion or chemical abortion in terms of why it might be psychologically more traumatizing even than surgical. One reason is there's a participatory role of the woman. She's actually directly responsible for the abortion. She puts the pill in her mouth. Someone else isn't performing a procedure on her. And this can exacerbate guilt and other negative self-directed thoughts and feelings. Medical abortion requires the woman to be more alert and involved during the process, making it impossible for her to distance psychologically from what's happening. The woman may see the expelled fetus. As a participant in a study by Halden and colleagues in 2008 explained, you really take your child's life. I think if you see it, then you see that you really do take the life of your child. The woman is more likely to be alone and without emotional support at the time of the abortion. The home generally, or the bathroom in particular, may become associated with the abortion. One's home may become a trigger for uncomfortable abortions as opposed to a refuge. And then there are some studies that compare psychological distress among women undergoing medical versus surgical abortion. Slade and colleagues, this is an older one, in 1998 found that compared to those who had surgical abortions, medical abortion recipients rated it as more stressful and experienced more disruption in their lives. Ashok and colleagues in 2005 reported 46.8% of women undergoing a medical abortion experienced a significant decline in self-esteem 2 to 3 weeks following the abortion, and this was a higher percentage than among those who had a surgical abortion, 39.5. Kelly and colleagues, 2010, reported women who underwent medical abortion had higher PTSD inclusion scores, nightmares, unwanted thoughts, and images than women who had surgical abortions. There's also some published data indicating the levels of psychological distress are comparable among women undergoing the two forms of termination. And now shifting gears here again, it's important to realize that abortion is inherently relational. Resolution of an unplanned pregnancy is based on each individual's previous experiences, the couple's connection to one another, each partner's relationship to the developing fetus, and many other personal, relational, and situational factors. If a pregnancy is terminated, the abortion becomes a part of the couple's shared history with potential to seriously impact their future. Studies have linked abortion with increased risk for various problems: communication difficulties, sexual problems, domestic violence, separation, and divorce. I published a study several years ago using a data set from Chicago, which showed a clear link between abortion history and engagement in casual sexual behavior. Lawson and colleagues in 2000 reported 12% of women and 18% of men indicated an abortion adversely affected their relationship. In a large, well-controlled longitudinal study by Barnett and colleagues published in 92, 22% of German women's relationships with their partners had ended by 1 year post-abortion. And in a Swiss longitudinal study of over 100 women, 31% reported at least one sexual problem 6 months post-abortion. And then there was a literature review by Bradshaw and Slade. I believe the publication year on that one was 2003. Concluded that 10 to 20% of women experience sexual problems in the early months after an abortion, and 5 to 10% of women report sexual difficulties a year later. So what are some of the sources of conflict before and after abortion? If we look at pre-abortion conflict, there may be differences in opinion related to the humanity of the fetus and the choice to abort. There might be perceptions of a partner as insensitive and insufficiently supportive. Addressing relationship issues such as commitment, desire to have children, confidence in a partner's parenting abilities, lifestyle factors, and long-term goals are necessary to arrive at a decision. So, there's a lot that gets discussed when there's an unplanned pregnancy, and so that can trigger a lot of unrest and difficulties within the relationship. There are also post-abortion conflict sources: negative post-abortion mental health and adverse emotions in the woman, her partner, and there now probably are 30 or 40 studies that have been published looking at the male response to abortion. Or both may increase the risk for ambivalent, withdrawn, antagonistic, or aggressive partner-directed behavior. There are many ways through which mental health problems may adversely affect relationships: reduced emotional energy, withdrawn behavior, communication difficulties, feelings of self-doubt or limited personal control, blaming one's partner for suffering incurred, substance abuse. Altered perceptions may result in feelings of estrangement from one's partner. Belief in the humanity of the fetus. Conklin and O'Connor in 1995 found that women who believed the fetus was human were at risk for negative emotions, low self-esteem, and low life satisfaction post-abortion. And then the studies generally indicate that approximately 50% of women who undergo an abortion believe that they're ending the life of a human being. So they have to somehow integrate that belief with all of their other thoughts about themselves. Oftentimes for women, they feel like it's a self-defense response. My life or the life of this baby. And when you're in a state of crisis, trying to resolve an unplanned pregnancy, typically decision-making deteriorates. I just wrote a report for Florida and investigated all the decision-making literature in psychology. And when you're under stress, particularly decisions that have moral content, we resort to emotion-based decisional processes rather than more rational, cognitive, thoughtful approaches to a decision that are likely to lead to an outcome that one can live with longer. So negativity may be turned outward and incite adverse partner-directed behaviors. Interestingly, Rebecca Walker, she's a women's rights activist and daughter of Alice Walker, conveys the impact of these beliefs. She said, the aftermath haunted me for decades. It ate away at my self-confidence, and until I had Tenzin, I was terrified that I'd never be able to have a baby because what I had done to the child I had destroyed. For feminists to say that abortion carries no consequences is simply wrong. Guilt. Studies show 29 to 75% of women who abort report guilt feelings. When plagued by abortion-related guilt, a person may feel as though he or she does not deserve to be happy or to be the recipient of a partner's love. And we see guilt even in cultures where abortion is very well accepted. We published a study in Medical Science Monitor in 2004 comparing Russian women to U.S. women. And in Russia, where at that time like 90% of pregnancies were ending in abortion, and yet 48% of the women experienced, 49% experienced guilt. Unresolved grief, bereavement. Carol and colleagues found that 43% of women reported grief right before abortion, and 31% reported feelings of grief 1 year later. Carol and Laos further found that 35% of men reported feelings of grief and or emptiness 4 months post-abortion. These researchers, who are not, as far as I can tell, aligned with any political position, very straightforward, honest researchers, and they concluded that abortion was a sad, ethically painful, and problematic act. If both partners experience grief, the nature and timing of their bereavement may differ based on gender differences. Men tend to exert greater control over the expression of painful emotions, intellectualize grief, and cope alone. Men are also inclined to identify their primary role as supporter for their partners. A paper published a few years ago in PLOS Medicine titled Association Between Intimate Partner Violence and Termination of Pregnancy, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis by Megan Hall and colleagues from King's College, provided an extensive scientific review of the topic, looking at this intersection between interpersonal violence and abortion. Some of the key findings here: intimate partner violence, including history of rape, sexual assault, contraception sabotage, and coerced decision-making, was associated with abortion. Women in violent relationships were more likely to have concealed their abortion from partners compared to women who were not victims of violence. Women welcomed the opportunity to disclose IPV and to be offered help. Strong conclusions are made by the authors. Healthcare professionals should be aware of the high rates of physical, sexual, and emotional violence among women seeking termination of pregnancy. Good practice obligates that termination services should have robust policies for ensuring women's safety and confidentially providing providing information and referral pathways for those who disclose IPV. Victims of interpersonal violence often do not freely choose abortion. Rather than assisting them to make autonomous decisions and helping them to safety and comprehensive services for trauma, they're sadly typically sent right back to the abusers. The traditional research focus on individual responses to abortion only sheds light on fragments of the larger picture of the human cost of abortion. With scientific knowledge, integrity, commitment, and compassion, we can assist professionals as they endeavor to empower women to make healthy choices for themselves and those dearest to them. And that's all I've got. So I'm happy to answer questions if you have time. Sure, if you have time for questions, I'm happy to answer. I don't know if the schedule permits it or went a little over. So.
Where's that?
Yes, we'll take questions.
Okay, any questions? Yes.
Today you're talking about risk factors.
Uh-huh.
What are risk factors and what are they important for?
What's that?
What are risk factors? What are they important for? What do they tell us?
I have a slide there, but basically they tell us, they give us information about particular women who are more likely to have a problem after an abortion. So if you're not sure of your decision, you're ambivalent, you're being pressured by other people, you view the embryo or fetus as a human being, so there are many factors. And they're often interactive, and they often don't occur exclusively. Like in the case of Stacey Zally, she had many of the risk factors, and she hung herself as a result. So, and there's definitions of that were in the slides, and there are copies of the slides back there too. Any other questions? Yes.
What do your studies, sorry, wait for the microphone.
What do your studies tell us about the best way to help women who are experiencing that ambivalence that you describe at a stage before they get to the abortion centre?
Well, I think it's very important that they are counseled effectively, that they're given time by professionals. And unfortunately, what happens in most abortion facilities is the assumption that women, if they appear there, they want the abortion and they want it quickly. But the data just doesn't suggest that. There are high levels of ambivalence. And so, in the United States, we're enacting laws, counseling laws, waiting period laws. So women have to be given the information, like in South Dakota and Missouri, which have I think 72 hours are the longest laws out there. So they'll come in, consult with the provider, be given information that, depending on the state, the form of that information may differ, but they're given information on alternatives, they're given information on the risks, and then they have time to think about it before coming back. And that's still not a lot of time. So it's hard, and the anti-coercion laws that we have require that the counseling try to get to the heart of whether or not the woman is freely choosing the abortion. But it's tough because there's often many people pressuring. I've been teaching college for 25 years. So many times I hear students say, I have to stay in school. I don't really feel like I have any choice. And, so there are so many different factors. But I think probably the best we can do is enact laws that require time for decision making. It's a decision that potentially impacts women throughout their lives and can lead to suicide. And so I guess the first step is kind of establishing that this literature is valid. And once there's more consensus on the literature, then in mainstream professional organizations, training that takes place with therapists, not necessarily just those who are, affiliated with an abortion provider, but in general, there'll be more openness to the potential trauma. The way, it is today, most of what you hear is that abortion really isn't a big deal. If women can't handle it, it's because they had problems before, but we really need sensitive pre-abortion counseling. And one of the 1217 bill, House bill in South Dakota that I'm currently working on at the airport, the lawyer I working with called, and so that case has been an extended one, but we litigated several different issues, but what Planned Parenthood is still fighting us on is they passed a bill in South Dakota where anyone seeking an abortion would have to consult with a crisis pregnancy center, hear the other side, and then go back to the provider if they still want to have the abortion. So that law, enables at least more information, a different form of information, tangible help if they want to keep the baby. So it's a good question.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
So, and thank you for a fantastic talk and
Oh, you're welcome.
very generous handouts, which I hope people will take.
Yes.
Just it's such an important point. And I counsel women after abortion, and ambivalence is a major problem, as you've explained fantastically. But a client made this really clear to me, and I think it's a really important point in our setting, that the ambivalence, the stigma around ambivalence about your pregnancy needs to be reduced. She was ambivalent about her pregnancy and she didn't know where to turn to.
Mm-hmm.
And when she went online, the abortion providers' websites put her off going to her GP, and they also put people off going to crisis pregnancies. They warn of hidden agendas. So for someone who feels ambivalent about their pregnancy, there's shame and stigma attached to it, and they all too often are just, the only place they can go is an abortion provider. So that's something that we can all help do. That if I know women who, out with the archwork, I know women who have wanted to get pregnant, and then in that first trimester, with all the things that are going on, are going, I don't even know if I want to be pregnant anymore, I don't even know if I want this baby. Ambivalence is a big thing, and if we're open about it, we really will be empowering women to overcome it.
And it's interesting too, that's very helpful information, but it's interesting too, you rarely hear anybody say they regretted having a baby, but how many regret having abortions? I honestly in my life have never heard a mom say, boy, I wish I hadn't had this kid. It just doesn't happen. So even if someone's ambivalent or really not wanting the pregnancy, by the time that baby's there, they've come around to the desire to have the baby, so.
Okay, 2 more questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned with the attrition rate for the big study from 2017 that there was a really high attrition rate and a very low number of people retained.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering what would be kind of average for this sort of study?
Well, I know like the Ferguson studies that were done in New Zealand, he retained about 80 to 85%. And reviewing materials for Missouri, in a real established researcher, I think his name was Amoko, said 30 to 40% attrition constitutes a fatal flaw. So they had double that. I personally, if it's below 70%, I don't think it's very meaningful. Okay.
How effective do you think anti-coercion laws would actually be if the onus was on the abortion provider to really delve in and find out what was going on? Because wouldn't there be a conflict of interest in them trying to perhaps dissuade someone or to find out if there was another factor involved before they allowed that to go ahead?
Yeah, I think you always have that if they stand to make money. So any counseling that's provided by the provider, it's rarely unbiased, and at least in the U.S., it's regulated by the laws in terms of what information has to be given to women. But even when they give it, like in South Dakota, sometimes they'll go through the risk. They'll say, "I'm telling you this because I have to," but the study's real, so they do what they get away with as much as they can to dismiss the information. So yeah, it really is horrendous in terms of what's provided. And the level of education among the counselors in the Stacey Daly case, the woman who counseled her prior to the abortion didn't even have a high school degree, and she was named in the lawsuit as well, which I personally thought wasn't too fair because, you know, she couldn't. It wasn't her fault she was hired and not capable of, you know, effectively counseling. And that woman ended up committing suicide as well. It was just such a whole tragic case. But, yeah. Okay, are we done? Okay, thank you.